Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Warren, and this is Me Reimagined, a space where we unlock the frozen parts of ourselves, the parts we hide from and hide from the world, so we can learn to believe we're enough. This is my very first Me Reimagined podcast, and I am feeling all the feels. Have you ever noticed that often when you do something new, you feel emotions that are at the opposite ends of the spectrum simultaneously? So today I feel excited, but I also feel terrified that I'm going to mess this up, which is kind of the perfect place to be, given that the whole point of this podcast is to look at how we can learn to believe we're enough. I have spent 47 years walking around with a soul full of not good enough, and it's gotten and is still getting in my way, even when I don't see it. Between my clients, family, friends, it's easy to see that this is universal. In fact, I would challenge you to come up with someone who doesn't struggle with good enough. Today, I'm going to tell you a little about my personal journey of not enoughness, as well as what I'm hoping to do with the podcast and how it developed. And then I'll talk a bit about the different formats that we're going to use because my top value is adventure. I am at my most creative and I do my best work when there's a lot of variety in my life. So I'm intentionally changing formats to keep some spice in what I'm creating. I also want to take a moment to flag that I want this to be very practical, not just entertaining. You have those podcasts that you binge, exactly like you do with Netflix, though I used to fool myself into thinking that podcasts weren't the same thing. But I'm just as addicted to Serial by the New York Times, which traps as equally as much of my focus and time as The Queen's Gambit or Ted Lasso. So, what I'm trying to say is that I hope this podcast will make you want to find an excuse to take a walk or a drive, but also that at the end of each episode, you'll walk away with reflection items and exercises, things that worked for me that I use with my clients. And then you can actually put them into play in your life. Now, if you look at my personal journey, the fine print, the details of my life, they're really individual. It's my experience. And I am well aware, as a white woman living in a wealthy country, mine is an experience of privilege. But privilege or not, white or not, female or not, the headlines of my journey are absolutely universal. They are the themes of what it means to be human. They are not mine alone. And the theme that underpins everything, and which I will try to back up with data throughout this podcast, is the feeling of not being enough, of not being capable or smart enough or strong enough or pretty enough, cool enough, or deserving enough. In fact, this feeling is so pervasive that I argue that we're experiencing an epidemic of not enoughness. And I think this is true on an individual, a group, a societal, and a planetary level. This feeling infects and affects all of us. And on an individual level, it feels terrible. The feeling that you are somehow not enough and you're also responsible for that. It's a big weight to bear. And that's actually the reason why the show will close with a song by Alexandra Blakely about how you don't have to bear this alone. Because one thing that is very important for me is that you feel so seen by this podcast, that we touch your experience. I want you to feel as if I am mirroring back to you what you are going through, and also mirroring back to you what you don't or what you can't see in the moment. That you are not only enough, but you and your experience are extraordinarily beautiful. I want you to feel connected to our community, to know that here is one place you will learn to practice self-compassion and learn to see that your broken pieces are the most beautiful and most precious. I want this to be a place where you will feel wrapped in warmth and acceptance just as you are. In fact, that's one of my favorite lines in Bridget Jones's Diary when Mr. Darcy says, "I like you very much, just as you are." And her friends are all aghast, asking, "What? Just like that? Not thinner or smarter or taller?" But the point of this for me is that they are aghast precisely because they don't like themselves. They don't like themselves enough. They are not enough for themselves. And so they can't imagine that someone else would like them for who they are. And that's really it. I want you to begin to learn to love yourself without a shadow of a doubt. Because that's what it is. We doubt we are enough to deserve love and acceptance, not only from the world, but from ourselves. And if you don't believe you're enough, that's what's communicated to everyone else, even when you are pretending. And we know what pretending looks like, right? You can see it in body language, something that I hope to talk more specifically about in a future episode. But the person who won't look you in the eye, and it doesn't matter if they're acting too cool or as if they don't have the right to look you in the eye. That's like the fear of failure or the fear of success. It comes back to the same core principle, not enoughness. Another example of a person pretending might be the aggressive person who fights immediately, who overwhelms you with shouting or won't listen. At their core, they are scared to receive what you might say because receiving means they might be wrong. And if they're wrong, then they're not enough. Not enoughness might look very different, but it feels universal. So the influencer with 2 million followers who feels pressure to always have makeup on and they obsessively monitor their comments, they feel the same as the quiet developer who gets lost in code, doesn't have many friends, maybe they were bullied in school for not being athletic. So their fine print is really different, right? They don't look alike, but they share the same headlines. And those headlines shout about negative feelings, self-doubt, about not being enough. Now, okay, this is a side tangent, but I have noticed that literally as I'm recording this podcast, there is a part of my mind focused on what I'm sharing, and another part of my brain asking if I really believe I'll be consistent and I'll record an episode every week as I've said I'll do. I am literally doubting myself in the very same breath that I am using to create a community that comes together to learn to believe they're enough. I find such a richness in that. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have even noticed the voice in my head. To come back to the epidemic of not enoughness, on an individual level, it feels terrible. It feels lonely because even though it's universal, it drives and it's driven by shame. So we hide from ourselves, from the world. We don't process the feelings. Who wants to feel shame? And we separate and we freeze out parts of ourselves so we can keep going. But while this feels terrible and turns the focus toward ourselves, what's scarier to me is how this feeling is informing and creating how we come together, how we build our systems from a feeling of scarcity, that we're not enough and that we must hide it. And we hide it so well we don't even recognize ourselves. And it's in this space that we design our school systems, our businesses, we create our policies, and we regulate it all. And so for me, this feeling of not enoughness, well, it started at birth. So my personal details is that I grew up United Methodist. I went to a Catholic school, so I got a triple dose of church every week. And one of the things I realized when I started digging into not enoughness is that the doctrines I was born into as a baby told me I bore the stain of original sin. I'm not going to go too far into religion here. This is not the main point, but I do want to take a moment to explain what that means. So essentially, original sin is a story of Adam and Eve. In this story, They're misled by a serpent or a snake, however you want to characterize that, who represents the devil. And after eating the apple, the fruit of knowledge, they get kicked out of paradise or the Garden of Eden. Now, I think there are a lot of ways that this story really sadly influences us, but the one here that I want to highlight today is the idea that this is the story that forms the basis for baptism. I was baptized into God's community. My parents accepted Christ for me. And at the same time, my stain of original sin was divinely removed. Now, I didn't question this until this year, which means that I just simply accepted as part of my culture, as part of my community, as part of my family, without questioning it until it was already bred in my bones, that I started as not enough. Just sit with that for a minute. The message that I received before thinking, saying, or doing anything was that I was not good enough. Now, I'm not a religious expert, and I don't know how many churches actively teach this now, but the effects of this are bred into the bone for me. Now, whether you were raised within that doctrine or not, what I want you to start thinking about is what well-intended messages might you have absorbed before you were 7? And I quote 7 because this is the age most commonly cited by which time our fundamental perception of ourselves as not enough is really cemented. It solidifies around age 7. So at 3 or 4, we begin to have a self-concept. But if you ask a 3 or 4-year-old to sort of describe themselves, the studies show that at those ages, identity is really descriptive. But it's around age 7 that the judgment and the prescriptive iterations of self-concept get locked in. Now, don't get me wrong, self-concept and identity are complicated. My state of not enough did not develop through a religious influence alone. And religion did a whole lot of good for me as well. I had a community that gave me a sense of belonging. The things that influence our state of enough or not enough, well, they're not good or bad or black or white. I like to think of these influencers as polarities. And I like to use Bina Sharma's definition that polarities are interdependent pairs of values or strengths that need each other over time for a system to thrive. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. One way I define myself is as a good mother. I make sure that my children are well fed, safe, have reliable structures around them. I take the time to talk to them and connect with them on their days and what's important to them. I tend to their hurts. But I also very much see myself as a professional with a purpose. Now, one of my children has autism and requires significantly more time and care than perhaps the others. But 4 kids in general take a lot of care, take a lot of time and effort. So what happens when this gets out of balance? Well, it really starts to impact my professional life. And I find myself penduluming between the 2 spheres of family and career, basically like a grandfather clock. Whenever I am too far in one sphere, I find that this is just me personally, that inner critic comes out and just showers me with judgment. And while the inner critic is never a pleasant experience for me, I really appreciate her because she is trying in her stingy, hard-loving way to get me to bring this back into balance. So it's balance that is key. And how we achieve that is something I will explore further on a different podcast. But coming back to the individual level, the group, the system or collective, the planet, the point that I want to make is that the systems within which we operate, they send messages that we as individuals internalize. And if we're all walking around receiving messages that we are not enough, especially when they are from people who love us, who we trust, who they want the best for us. In fact, they themselves mold their lives around, you know, a concept. And that concept isn't so much talked about. My family didn't walk around talking about original sin, but it definitely permeated their daily life. Well, if that's the message that I've been receiving, then it is no wonder that I and anybody else who has received those kinds of messages, we don't like ourselves or believe in ourselves. So, firstly, what I wanted to ask you to do is investigate those messages. Where in your life did you absorb messages? Either directly, somebody said it to you, or implicitly, it's just implied in what's expected, that you weren't enough in some way. Sometimes just awareness helps us shift those patterns. It helps us begin to separate the message from who we are as people. And then, secondly, I want you to think about our systems. I mean, when a group of people gets together to design a system and each person feels not enough, what do you end up with? For me as an individual, not enoughness feels terrible. I feel scared, angry. I feel resentful, like I need to fight to protect myself to get what I need. And this feeling, well, it unleashes an avalanche of stress hormones. Now, if I'm creating something in this state, from this perspective of fight and control and anger, am I going to create something warm and positive and flowing that brings joy? Or more likely, I'm going to create something that sees people as inherently flawed and seeks to control and protect my personal interests. And when each of us brings this state into how we come together collectively, I believe it adds up to the social ills that we see in the world. The connection between each of us feeling not good in our own ways, well, it affects how we come together and then the larger outcomes in the world, which, if you look at them, are heartbreaking. Many of them. Now, that might feel like a big leap to make right now, but I'm hoping that after a few episodes of this podcast, that connection's going to become really clear. Because if together we heal this epidemic of not enoughness and we begin to come together with ourselves, our people, and the more than human world differently, then we change the outcome. And if we are creating systems in our community groups, our businesses, our governments, from a space of open resonance with enoughness, then the world becomes less polarized, less isolated, less closed and protective, less unequal, more forgiving and embracing. So that's a little about what I'm hoping to achieve with the podcast. So let me tell you a little bit about my personal journey. So I'm an American living in Switzerland. I grew up a Californian, beached in landlocked Oklahoma, and I've been currently living in Switzerland for the last 17 years. My partner makes fun of me for always letting people know that I was part Californian, but I think it's because Oklahoma is quite conservative, and I am not at all conservative. I would describe myself as an adventurer, an introverted extrovert, if that makes any sense, and I feel freest hanging off the side of a cliff. I would describe myself as a bookie, by which I mean I devour fiction about the human experience, and I'm also a psychology geek. I am a late to the party devout meditator. Oh my God, I could not meditate when I started. I hated it. But now I see the impact and I love it. And I'm currently focused on breath work. And I would describe myself as a dancing in the kitchen mother. In fact, I manifested a big family for myself, which showed up very differently than I expected. So I have a son who is half American, half Cameroonian, and 3 German stepchildren. And we speak French at home. This is not at all what I would have thought I would have gotten. I also am a person who loves massages, coming of age or self dramas like sex education. And I love laying on the floor laughing helplessly with my son over nonsense. I've been described as skiing hell for leather down the slopes. And it's true. I have a high tolerance for speed and risk. I would say I'm half overachiever. Problems exist to be fixed. There is a nothing we can't do if we set our minds to it. You tell me I can't, and oh, I will. And now in the second half of my life, I would also say that I'm half spiritualist. You could say energy, matrices, and messages in the stars. Now, I am, and I was, all of those things. But that is the fine print, the pieces that may be more unique to me. I don't know how many listeners are 47 and self-leadership coaches, or a mother of a menagerie, or someone who used to wear a Care Bear sweatshirt rocking 80s bangs. But the headlines, those attention-grabbing, bite-sized chunks of info where you don't really read the article, but you definitely take away the catastrophic message. Well, those headlines are universal. And the headline of my life was, and in some ways still is, though I am leaning into it so hard that I may fall flat on my face. But I've read that you can't go under it, can't go over it, you've got to go through it. I got that out of a children's book. But I find their wisdom is just universal. And true, so true. Anyways, the neon headline of my life has been not enoughness. And I really hate admitting it. I hate it. Looking back, I can see how this feeling influenced my self-concept, my worldview, all of my relationships. It has influenced all of my outcomes. This feeling is built into the fabric of my life. So I'll give you a few examples. In my 20s, I thought my value and power lay in being as pretty as possible. Never look older than 17 was something an older attorney at a law firm I worked for actually said to me. I thought my value and power lay in being smart, but only smart enough to check everyone else's boxes, right? And I actually had a boss who would get irritated if I challenged her viewpoint, even if I had evidence that her way didn't work. And I also thought that value and power lay in protecting my virginity, because without that, I was worthless. No man would want me. And I'm not actually sure if that was my mother's personal belief or if she was using that to avoid teen sex. Either way, it worked. I cried on my wedding day because I was grateful to my husband at that time for marrying me. I felt such a mess inside that I was actually grateful that he would marry me. I didn't see the woman he saw. And in every job I've ever had, I've worked my way to the top. But often that meant staying silent and just looking to please the boss. And in many instances, it actually meant not doing my job, not speaking up and disrupting processes or systems that were harmful. It meant not challenging authority. I took on those roles. And notice that's plural because it didn't matter if I was at a newspaper or a law firm or the NGO. I took on those roles because I needed people to like me. I needed to check the box to prove that I was successful, that I was enough. And of course, what that meant is that in any of those areas, my appearance, my intelligence, my partnership, my professional life, it was never enough. And for a long time, into my 40s, I was largely unconscious of this, which meant that I was flying blind. It was directing my life, and I didn't even know it. In fact, the overachiever I was, and in some ways still am, I'm going to have to admit this, I still get in fights with children over winning board games. But the overachiever that I was would not only have sarcastically told you to fuck off, but would have pointed to all of my achievements as proof that this was not an issue for me. But now, when I look back closely over the course of my life, I can see how this permeated and still influences my worldview. It influences my choices, my relationships, my outcomes. And this is a relatively recent discovery And so I've spent the last 5 years in sort of dedicated eradication mode. Like you could say like an antivirus software using a shock and kill approach. And imagine my distaste when I realized that the actual antidote was not an aggressive, linear 12-step program, but acceptance, and self-compassion. In fact, it wasn't until a Mel Robbins podcast episode in which she asked, "What if you leaned into what you see as your biggest weakness as your biggest strength?" I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. But it was in that episode that I realized that maybe this not being enough, which I was already focusing on, well, maybe that was what I needed to embrace and wrap my arms around. So that's a little bit about how the podcast was born and what I'm hoping to do with it. So let me talk you through what the 4 formats are going to look like. So this podcast is going to feature 4 formats. The first one is going to be a solo episode of musings or reflections about a topic within enoughness. So similar to the episode today. And then we'll keep that theme and dive a bit deeper into it with an invited guest. And those guests are going to be a mix of experts and also our community members. Those of you who are out there who are having questions and thoughts about something, I'm going to invite you onto the show and we're going to have a conversation. So the third style we're going to use is what I'm calling car karaoke. So you might remember James Corden driving around singing with celebrities. Well, that's the format I want to use to look at pop culture and how it shapes the story of not enoughness. And then vice versa, how our culture and systems are informed by the very feeling that they are perpetuating. But I don't want this to be heavy. What I want to convey is that digging into uncomfortable topics, if we're doing it in community and we are singing at the top of our lungs, it can be fun. So the very last format we're going to use is a debate. And what I'm hoping to do with this is help us get comfortable with having discussions that trigger us, that are around really sensitive topics that divide us, so that we get used to it. It becomes familiar. We practice active listening to enhance our understanding, to help us tap into something within ourselves, and to find where the two polarities, what they have in common, where they come together. And I'd like to invite our community to contribute suggestions for what to dig into for that episode. So I just want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing the journey with me today. Thank you for holding space, for coming together to heal this epidemic within ourselves. Together, we will learn to believe and act from a space of enoughness. I'm going to close every episode with a little bit of gratitude and what I'm feeling thankful for, and then some final questions for you to reflect on or share with others to deepen your own connection and intimacy. So today, I am thankful for my mother. Her 78th birthday is coming up, and she's so vibrant. In fact, I ordered her a racing paddle for her birthday because she's part of a dragon boat crew. And her team came in first in a recent competition. And what that left me feeling was that I am grateful that I am made of the same stuff she's made of. And another thing I'm feeling thankful for is my journey. I can see the progress that I'm making. It's so small, but I have finally stopped biting my nails. And it coincides with my decision to embrace not enoughness and to share that with this community. I think that long nails are so elegant, but I've never been able to grow them, mostly because the not enough gremlin needed to eat them to cope with the feelings. And seeing that the gremlin isn't as active and my nails are finally long is literal physical proof that my theoretical knowledge is becoming embodied. And I think lastly, I'm thankful for the mountains that I can see out my window. I live in Switzerland and I have a view on Mont Blanc, which is actually across the lake in France. And the sun is gleaming off the snow-covered peak, even though down here where I'm sitting, it's 25 degrees Celsius or what is that in Fahrenheit? 77 degrees. I don't take it for granted that I live in a country that has a nature that is just absolutely luxurious. It is so deeply green and diverse. It's temperate. And I watch what's predicted with the climate change for these mountains and lakes and the wildlife, and it makes me stop in my tracks and revel in the beauty of it now because it may not be so luxurious very shortly. And I use it. It reminds me to recommit to doing my part, to doing the small things every day, the changes I can make to support and add value to my ecosystem, the ecosystem that supports me. And I feel really grateful for it because I did not grow up with this kind of landscape. And so I really don't want to lose it. But to close, I want to leave you with some questions for your heart. What messages did you absorb? Messages that you may have noticed and messages that you might not have that were hidden, but messages that were about your enoughness, your value, your worth. Where did those messages come from? Drop a note in the comments. I'd love to hear about both positive and negative messages because while we're trying to be conscious of and sort of unravel the negative messages, we are simultaneously trying to tap into and amplify the positive messages. And then, secondly, how do those messages influence you in your everyday moments? How do they impact your worldview, your relationships, your career, your health, or your freedom? Leave a comment and tell me about you, your messages. What did you receive? What did you experience? Join the conversation and let this community hold a little space for you. I really enjoyed this first podcast experience. I love working through things that matter with you. And I really appreciate this community, all of you out there doing your best and learning, ever so slowly, with ups and downs and upside downs, to believe that you are enough, to see that you are magnificent. And until you can see it, let this community mirror it back to you. If you are as excited for the next episode as I am, subscribe to the podcast. You will be able to find all the episodes on meganwarrencoaching.com. And if you leave a comment, I'll definitely reply. With love, until next time.
You do not carry this all alone. No, you do not carry this all alone. This is way too big for you to carry this on your own. So you do not carry this all alone.